what we do at IATP is we work at the intersection of policy and practice. So we're kind of working in the middle of the farmers, the people on the ground, the landowners, the ones that are working, and the policymakers, the ones that are in charge of the incentive programs, they're in charge of the extension, the outreach, all of that. And we're trying to have a conversation between those two worlds to ensure fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems for all people. So agriculture is really critical in this climate conversation because we all need food. We all need food that we can afford, and we all need food that has good impacts for the people creating it and for the earth. So, wait, I just went to the end. So getting back to it, I'm just kidding, it's not over that fast. First thing that we believe here is that climate change is real and occurring, and that has some big impacts for agriculture. We're going to see a lot more extreme weather events, more floods, more droughts, more extreme heat and extreme cold. And this debate about climate change is actually less prevalent than a lot of us think it might be. There was this recent study in rural Nebraska, which a lot of us might consider maybe the heart of climate denialism, but out of 2,300 responses, 73% of those folks believe that climate change is happening. So it's a pretty small group of people, and it might be a loud group, but a small group that's really out there saying that climate change is not happening. And I can also speak to this because just last week, a group of us from IATP were out in Morris, Minnesota, which is a town of 5,000 people in western Minnesota. It's a farming community, and out of the 15 people that we had a jury with there, a 3-day-long citizens jury, they were all on board. They all could see the weather impacts. They all knew that in order to keep their farms growing good things, that we needed to do something about these droughts and these floods and create farms that were resilient in the face of these weather events. So the second thing is that agriculture is critical for both adaptation and mitigation. So there's no question that agriculture needs to adapt in order to continue growing healthy food, but it's also uniquely poised to mitigate climate change in that it has the ability to sequester carbon. So the plant roots are able to keep more carbon underground and take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. And finally, current proposals for how to include agriculture in climate policy are not working. And part of this is because there are not a lot of current proposals for climate policy. We saw a little bit of progress in the past couple of weeks when the EPA announced the coal rules, but that's more on the emission side of things. As far as agriculture and climate policy, we've got the Farm Bill, which I wouldn't say is a shining light over the many sorts. In fact, most conservation programs were significantly cut in this last iteration of the Farm Bill. A lot of them are still there, but maybe not in the same version that they used to be, maybe with slightly fewer dollars attributed to them. And so we need some new proposals that are going to help us transition to this resilient agricultural system. So I kind of wanted to take a look at where we are today with agriculture, how we got there. And to put it in perspective, humans have been farming for about 10,000 years, and we've been farming the way that we farm today for about 60. So it's really resulted from the need to scale up. It was post-World War II era, and there was a realization that there's a lot more mouths on this earth to feed, and at the time it seemed like a really cool technological triumph that we could produce so much food on such little land, and we could keep scaling it up, and there was this huge emphasis on increasing yield. But as you all probably know, this also increased our reliance on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and insecticides. And a lot of farms today are treated as factories, same assembly lines that are pumping out cars or microwave dinners. But it doesn't work that way because agriculture is really reliant on intricate natural processes on the soil and on water and on a lot of things that don't work the same way that a machine does. And yet we're trying to make it that way with the inputs like the chemicals and then hoping that there's an output like the crop. And it's worked for a little bit and now it's starting to not work so well. And like I said, it seemed like such a technological triumph at the time, but when we look at this, in 1940, before this industrialization occurred, we were having 2.3 food calories produced for every 1 fossil fuel calorie input. Seems pretty good. But today we're getting 1 food calorie for every 10 fossil fuel calories inputted. And that is a 23-fold reduction in efficiency from industrialization. And so in a way, it seems like we are pumping out a lot of food, but we are also using a lot of chemicals and a lot of water to produce that food, and it is extremely, extremely inefficient. At the root of a lot of this is monoculture farming. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, monoculture farming is when you grow one crop year after year on the same parcel of land. So where I live in Minnesota, I can drive around the rural areas and pass cornfield after cornfield after cornfield and know that my drive through those areas in the years before, I was also seeing cornfield after cornfield after cornfield. There's not a lot of diversity out there on that land. When you're growing one crop on the same parcel of land year after year, it's taking the same nutrients out of the soil. And the soil doesn't have the ability to replenish any of the nutrients that have been taken out of it. So this lack of soil nutrients also leads to increased pest and disease. And as you can imagine, with increased pest and disease, you also need a lot more chemicals to combat those things. So the monoculture has really given way to a lot of the problems that we're seeing in agriculture today. These agrochemicals deplete soil nutrients, but on top of it, they're increasing erosion and topsoil loss. And one of the most heart-wrenching impacts of it to me is the way they get into our waterways. So a lot of times excess chemicals are applied to agricultural operations, and farmers don't often do this on purpose. If you think about it, they're paying for every chemical that they put on their field. So it doesn't make sense to apply more than the plants can use, but a lot of times timing or specific plant requirements make it really unclear as to what exactly is needed. And excess chemicals, they can either percolate down into the groundwater, or in any sort of rain event, they can run straight off into the waterways. And this map here at the bottom of it, you can see the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico, that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But basically, agricultural chemicals running into the Mississippi River has resulted in an enormous algal bloom down in the Gulf. It's choked out all of the oxygen from that area of water, and there's huge fish kills, biodiversity loss, and it's really poison in the water. There are a lot of human health effects from this too. There are over 600 active pesticide ingredients in use, and we only have adequate toxicological data for 100 of those. That leaves 500 that we really have no idea what they're doing was. And again, there haven't been completely conclusive studies, but these chemicals are potential endocrine disruptors, it's hard to say, potential carcinogens. They potentially have immune system effects and reproductive system effects. And there have been plenty of cases of people working in close contact with agricultural chemicals that have gotten sick. So in this case, I would say it's better to be safe than sorry. But we're forging ahead anyway with these chemicals, and it's kind of a scary battlefield. And a lot of them are also leading to weed and pest resistance. When you're using the same weapon on a pest year after year, so in this case on weeds or insects, those weeds and insects become resistant to that weapon because the genes that can resist that weapon become stronger and perpetuate year after year. And we saw this with the release of Roundup and Roundup Ready technology. Monsanto had what, I guess in theory, if you didn't know anything about the subject, would be a great idea in that they had Roundup Ready seeds that you could plant and then spray with the chemical Roundup, and it would kill all the pests, but it wouldn't kill the plant because the plant was Roundup Ready. But now we're seeing all kinds of weeds that have become resistant to Roundup, and they're coming up in these crop fields, and the farmers have no idea how to deal with them because they're not responding to any of the chemicals that they've used so far. So we have these super weeds and these super bugs that are taking over in a way that farmers don't know how to deal with. And then we have this all from a carbon perspective, or greenhouse gas perspective, I should say. But carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas emitted through human activities. And in agriculture, it comes from three main things. The first is the fertilizer production. It takes a lot of fossil fuels to produce these chemicals. And then also equipment use and transportation. Farm equipment is big and requires a lot of fuel. And farm fields are really big too. So all of those passes over the fields are also burning carbon dioxide. But some of the scariest greenhouse gases from agriculture are nitrous oxide and methane that come a lot from fertilizer and from livestock operations, and those are much more potent than carbon dioxide. So we really need a change here. That was all very depressing, and I'm about to talk about some things that we can do, none of which is particularly supported in policy right now. But if you look on there's your left, that is what we see for probably 9 out of the 12 months of the year in Minnesota. It's an uncovered brown spot, more or less. The soil's being blown up, there's a lot of erosion. And we need to get to that picture on the right, which is living soil with high organic matter from plants that have decomposed in the soil. We've got some life in there. And it's not just a carbon problem, it's a soil problem. We really need to build up the soil resilience on farms. So agriculture can act as this carbon sink. Undisturbed land stores carbon naturally because the plant roots are able to pull the carbon underground out of the atmosphere. But then again, disturbing that land releases the carbon straight back into the atmosphere. So you can do some really great carbon sequestration work for about 10 years and then plow it once and it's all back in the air. So it's really hard to put a price on this carbon that's being sequestered, but we do know that agroecological farming practices, which I'm about to talk about, can increase the amount of carbon that's stored on a farm. So the first one I'm going to talk about is probably my least favorite because it comes with a lot of problems, but conservation tillage and no tillage are one way to oftentimes help soil fertility. So most farming relies heavily on tillage or plowing to kill the crop at the end of the year and sometimes to incorporate the seed into the ground. And it reduces or conservation tillage is when 30 to 60% or 30 to 90% it might be of the crop residue is left on the ground, and then that plant matter can get incorporated into the soil and build up the soil organic matter. No-till is when there's no tilling at all and 100% of the plant matter is left there. So conservation till and no-till, they both reduce soil erosion and runoff. They add the organic matter to the soil by leaving the crop residue on the field. They increase the soil water holding capacity because that comes along with increased soil organic matter. And they reduce emissions from farm equipment because there are fewer passes over the field with that big machinery. But the biggest reason why conservation till and no-till are my least favorite to advocate is because a big advantage of tilling the soil is that it kills weeds. And so sometimes when a field isn't tilled, it does have higher weed populations and requires extra chemicals. But there's still plenty of ways to do it right, but some of the barriers of why this isn't implemented more is that it does require extra planning. In order to switch over to conservation tillage or no-till, there are different timings and methods of fertilizer application that farmers need to take into consideration. There's new soil moisture and temperature considerations. And a lot of that requires a big risk. And more than risking their crop yield, they're also risking their family's income and their ability to feed themselves, feed their families. And so taking a risk is really hard. And there are also a few incentives to change. There are no programs out there that are telling farmers to till less. Again, some of the programs that we're advocating that were cut in this iteration of the Farm Bill. Then there's also crop rotations, which are really exciting to me. So I was talking about driving past these cornfields that are corn on corn on corn. But if you diversify that rotation a little bit and grow 3 crops in rotation, it greatly boosts the soil fertility. So you could grow corn one year, and then soy the next year, and then oats the next year. And by doing that, you don't have the same crop that's taking the same nutrients out every single year. Instead, you have different crops that are taking different nutrients out, and in the off years, the soil is rebuilding the other nutrients. And so rotating crops like this, it prevents pests and disease, because the pests and diseases aren't able to take as much hold and take over. And it also reduces the need for chemicals, because the soil fertility is already being boosted, so you need less fertilizer. And with less pests and disease, you don't need the same types of pesticides or herbicides. So this kind of seems like it would be a no-brainer, but there are still quite a few barriers out there as to why more farmers aren't using crop rotations. And one is that even without subsidies, there are still huge market incentives to grow corn and soy. There's a lot of demand out there. A lot of the farm infrastructure is set up for corn and soy, and a lot of the farm equipment, which is very expensive, is already purchased to grow those crops. And then there's not a lot of a market for some of the other crops. A farmer can put alfalfa into their rotation, but if there is no processing facility or distribution facility nearby, you might as well not have grown it other than to boost the soil fertility, but he's not going to get a penny off of it if there's no market out there to purchase it. And then finally, social norms are a huge influencer of farmer decision making, and so even as it becomes a little bit more clear that not rotating your crops is not the best idea for your operation. If you're driving down the street and all of your neighbors are doing the same thing year after year, it's really easy to think, maybe this isn't so bad. But this is a study that, Iowa State, I was like, Iowa State or University of Iowa, but it was Iowa State did, that proves that longer rotations are much more effective than shorter rotations. And if you look on the left, that is a 2-year rotation. So that is rotating corn and soy. Growing corn 1 year and soy the next. In the middle is a 3-year rotation, so growing corn and then soy and then oats. And then all the way on the right is a 4-year rotation, throwing a 4th crop in there of growing corn, then soy, then oats, then alfalfa. And as you can see here, the energy input per crop, it drops dramatically for corn the second that you put that 3rd crop in there. And so we need to get some incentive programs on the ground that help farmers grow that 3rd crop, that establish markets for that 3rd crop. And I don't want to get too derailed here, but biofuels or biomaterials are one way to create such a market. I put pictures here of some commonly researched grasses that can be turned into biomaterials. We have switchgrass, prairie mixes, and camelina. And there are some companies out there that are already doing this. For instance, Gevo. There's a processing facility in Laverne, Minnesota that retrofitted an ethanol plant and is now producing biobutanol out of plant materials. The Air Force has started using a completely plant-based drop-in jet fuel. Coca-Cola is trying to develop a completely plant-based bottle. So there are markets for this. They're just not very big yet. But if we had those markets and the distribution centers needed, we could really boost this market and then have farmers growing switchgrass, the prairie mix, the camelina every 3rd year to help their soil health, to provide some pollinator habitat, and to really be a good idea all around. And then getting back onto the topic, we also have cover cropping, which is another agroecological practice. That picture that I showed before, the before photo of the farm with that big brown spot, that is leaving the soil completely exposed to the elements. By planting cover crops, you have continuous living cover on the ground, and you can either plant these crops interseeded with the commodity crops or after you terminate the commodity crops. And some examples of cover crops are different types of radishes or sorghum, different types of grasses. But having some sort of cover on the ground year-round protects the soil from erosion, and it's building the soil organic matter, again, by having the plant material there and build up that soil organic matter underground. The biggest barriers with cover crops are that they can interfere with spring planting if the termination is, if farmers in any way unsure of the termination. And then also, subsidies were done away with in this last Farm Bill, and they were replaced with crop insurance. And crop insurance has a lot of tricky language in it, and there are stipulations in there that if farmers plant cover crops and they don't terminate them to the day at the right time for their climatic zone, they're completely disqualified for collecting on crop insurance in the case of a bad weather year. So a lot of them are really wary of planting some of these cover crops because, again, if they miss a window by 1 day, they may be throwing their entire income for the year down the drain, provided that there was a drought or a flood or something that prevented their crop from growing. So this lack of knowledge or confidence is really there, and it has nothing to do with knowing that cover crops are good for their operations. It has more to do with the tiny little details of exactly which days and exactly which species and how to get it in there. And then of course there's the barrier of equipment. Again, this might require different types of equipment, and these machines that farmers use cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and can't just be replaced year to year. So the barriers are real. And so now I have a picture here of Dave Brown, and he is a farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota, and he has started implementing everything that I just talked about. And the tricky part about it is it took his farm 4 or 5 years to become profitable at all after he switched to any of these practices. And so we really need to find some policy to put in place that can support farmers in that 4 to 5 year transition before their fields start being as profitable. But I have, I think it's just short of 4 minutes here of video, having him talk to you all about this himself.
The guy from the AV hotel is going to come up because we're going to keep that in the internet every 20 minutes, so he's going to come up right now and make sure that hooked up, okay?
Okay, well anyway, it was much more powerful hearing it from him than from me because I'm not a farmer, but I've seen this work on a lot of farms, and this is a really inspirational guy, so this would be worth the username and the password every once. And again, not everyone has the luxury to do that, so we need some stuff in place here. And this is my very broad blueprint for a better approach, but to give agriculture responsibility for its greenhouse gas emissions, but then also recognize the mitigated role that it can play and support it in that. And then acknowledge and provide policy support for agriculture based on the multifunctional approach, knowing that we need to change up a lot of practices. We need to look at tilling a little bit differently. We need to increase the diversity on farms and maybe have cover on the ground more months of the year. And provide predictable and sufficient payments to farmers for climate-friendly practices, especially in that 4 or 5 year transition period while their farms are really getting built up to be resilient on their own. And then we need to increase the extension and the outreach necessary to get these practices really taking hold. And then I'm just ending with this little cartoon. I'm sure all of us have seen it before, but it seems to make a lot of sense. There are so many benefits to this other than adapting and mitigating climate change. We're going to have healthier waterways, fewer human health effects, and even if we don't have the exact answer, it is time to do something. And now it actually is time for the final slide. So thank you so much.